Apparently, at some point Sunday, I didn't say something exactly like I should have said it because it was either misunderstood or misleading or whatever. But when we were talking about the raising of Jairus's daughter from the dead, um, I said something about it was the three. It was one of three in the New Testament. Apparently, that's what I said. That's not what I meant to say. Um, it was one of the three that Jesus performed that are recorded in the New Testament, and more specifically, the Gospel. But we do know from our study in Acts, and Jason brought up one name, and I could not understand what he said. If I'd understood that he said Eutychus, I would have known. Yep, you're right. But where we went from that was that Jesus had the power to raise from the dead, and he instilled that, or he gave that power um, to the apostles. He said he would. He said, "You'll heal, you'll heal lepers, you'll raise the dead." And I specifically mentioned that the first one that's recorded by an apostle was Dorcas, Tabitha, Acts the 9th chapter, when Peter raised her. Um, and Jason correctly pointed out that Eutychus was another, but of course that came much later, the 20th chapter of Acts, when, of course, as you recall, Eutychus fell asleep during the sermon. Oh, Matt's not in here now. Um, Eutychus fell asleep when Paul was preaching and fell out of a third-story window, and yes, he fell to his death. But Paul, of course, told him not to worry, that he's fine. And so that was another incident in the book of Acts. So certainly there was more than just the three in the New Testament. However, there's only three of Jesus's ones that were recorded in the New Testament for us. One of them we had already talked about, and that was the son of the widow of Nain. And then one that comes later, which we made reference to on Sunday, of course, is the raising of Lazarus. And it was, of course, the raising of Lazarus which precipitated the crucifixion. It was not the one of Jairus' daughter, because Jesus used a term that he frequently used to disguise what he was actually doing. And he used the term, "Oh, they're simply asleep." That was to throw off the Pharisees, so that the Pharisees would not come after him right off the bat for his blasphemous acts, because remember, they had still were not accepting of who he was and what he was. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I did not mean, if that's what happened, I did not mean to mislead anyone about that. But as we finish up now, just a few more brief remarks about, in fact, the raising of Jairus's daughter. Remember, we talked about the difference in performing the miracles for Jesus. It made no difference to him, because he had power to perform whatever wonder was necessary to be performed. Okay? And some detractors have said, well, doing this particular miracle is not as hard as doing another or whatever. It's sort of like, which sin is worse than others? Well, there's no sin that's any worse than any other, because any unrepented sin is going to lead to condemnation. But the point being is that since Jesus has power over all things, raising someone from the dead is no more difficult for him than cleansing a leper. Um, and some would say, well, she may not have been completely dead. Well, Jesus said she was, and that's good enough for me. And everybody thought she was. They say, well, she wasn't as dead as the widow's son. Well, what difference does that make? Dead is dead, Um, and the fact is that while she may have only been dead a little while, we do know that she was dead because the professional mourners had already started the wailing and the other parts of the funeral. The son of Nain, the widow of Nain, was dead and on his way to be buried. Whereas in the future, of course, Lazarus will have been dead for 4 days and nights. So it doesn't make any difference how long someone's been dead in terms of Jesus' ability, Jesus' power to bring them back to life. And the fact that he used the term of being asleep was very common. Was a very common expression on his part, because this is why it was a very common part of his language in talking about those things. Because if Jesus knew that he was going to bring someone back from death, he would know that in his eyes, all they're doing is sleeping. He's just going to raise them back up to the feet. And we know that Jairus' daughter, of course, was brought back and resumed her natural functions of any 12-year-old young lady, girl. And we know that she obviously was alive, because what did Jesus tell them to do when she got up? Feed her. She needs some nutrition. So only for those who are perpetual antagonists would think that it was not a valid raising from the dead. Okay, so but again, as has been his custom, his instructions were, don't tell anyone. And again, for the same reasons as he's been telling them all along. His time, he knew, was not yet there. It was not time for him to go to the cross, so to speak. So it was important that they not make it any harder on his being able to move about and continue doing his good works by making such a big deal of it that it would bring down the wrath of the Pharisees and the scribes upon him. Regardless of the fact that he did perform this miracle for someone who was of a fairly high status, ranking only below scribes, in terms of Jairus being a manager or a ruler or of the council of elders of the synagogue there in Capernaum. So we're going to see something a little bit different when we talk about the account of the two blind men and the demoniac, because even though Jesus gives instructions for them not to do something, they do it anyway. And we'll talk about the consequences of that, or the validity or the integrity of that. But as we said, sandwiched in between the two parts, at least in Mark's account, of the healing of the raising of Jairus' daughter, was a healing of a woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. The fact that she'd been hemorrhaging for 12 years has no corresponding relationship to the fact that Jairus' daughter was 12 years old, even though some tried to make a deal out of that. Okay? The point is that she had been hemorrhaging for such a long period of time, and she had been to doctor after doctor, at least to Mark's account. To Mark's account, she had spent just about all of her life's earnings on doctors, and they had tried all kinds of remedies, at least as best as medical science could provide for her at that time, without success. Mark really went after the doctors, the physicians. Dr. Luke puts a little bit different slant on it that we'll talk about in just a minute. But Mark says that not only did they not fix her, but they probably made things even worse for her. What that means in terms of someone who's been hemorrhaging 12, I don't know how you could get any worse. But nevertheless, Mark was very specific that this woman, of course, had a long-term malady, illness, whatever brought on the hemorrhaging. Now, it's interesting though when you look at Luke's account. Luke kind of he doesn't hit so hard on the doctors, probably because he understood it from a little bit different perspective. Mark's looking at it from a layman's perspective, as you and I would look at it, unless you're a medical professional. Whereas Luke, being the physician that he is, probably understood the limitations that science had in medical science had in those days. And so the way that he puts it, it comes across as he didn't contradict Mark. He just didn't go into as much detail on hammering them because they couldn't do anything for her. Luke's account makes it more reasonable in terms of, look, the doctors did everything that they knew what to do or how to do. It just didn't work. So apparently she had some malady or some illness or whatever brought on this hemorrhaging to where they simply could not cure her. Now, you can think about it in terms of this. Whether this whole situation was orchestrated so that Jesus could show that he is the ultimate physician, both in terms of physical as well as spiritual, because every physical healing that Jesus performed and every raising from the dead, if you don't see the spiritual application, then you're missing something, because that was the whole purpose in what he did and why he did things. So his healing of the woman who had the hemorrhage of 12 years was significant from two standpoints. First of all, Jesus is more powerful than any physical physician or medical science could be or could ever have been. Okay? The second thing is, when you stop and think about it, is I'm having a senior moment. Give me a second. I had the note right here. Let's see, 2 points. One was Jesus was demonstrating his infinite power, okay, his infinite power to heal all things. And he was also showing those around. Oh, I know it. Okay, here's where I was going with this. Here's one of the spiritual implications. Remember that when God designed the garments that males would wear way back in Old Testament times. You go into, I think it's Leviticus, the 15th chapter, and it describes their outer cloak and everything. And there was in the four corners of the cloak was to be a tassel, and which would have a blue, I think it was a blue band on it. And what God intended that to be was a reminder to the wearer who they belonged to. Okay? But what had transpired over the years is it had become a focal point so that people had built up almost a superstition that if they simply touched that part of the garment that man was wearing, that garment would have the powers of the being that was wearing it in order to make them whole again, okay? Which was also a common expression. So when she touched Jesus, Jesus knew it. And how did he know it? Apparently, every time Jesus did one of these powerful things, he felt it. Physically, he felt it. That's the description that's given. He knew when someone touched him. He knew when a power emanated from him in order to perform one of these miraculous signs or wonders. And so his question was not, who touched me? He knew who had touched him. He wasn't that was a rhetorical question. Jesus knows who touched him, but that was his way of telling others that something had happened. And he was using that as another means of impressing upon those that were in his presence of the power that faith has in an individual. Remember that most of the miracles that had been performed up to this time, it brought belief, or it brought faith on the part of not necessarily the recipient, because if you're dead, you can't have faith already. I mean, but on those who saw it, okay, who were party to it happening. Whereas in these miracles, remember, as we studied, he started shifting gears, so to speak, in that he was impressing upon all of those around him who were party to what was taking place, that it was the faith of the individuals, it was the belief of the individuals that he had the power to heal them that was making them whole. And remember, we're not talking about a faith, a faith only situation. We're simply saying, what Jesus was simply saying is that, for instance, in Jairus' case, when he said, you have to believe, Jairus, he was doing that because Jairus didn't have any other alternative. Because if Jairus didn't maintain his faith in Jesus being able to do to perform this sign, this wonder, then his only other alternative was to do what his peers were telling him to do, and that was just go bury her, because she's dead. So when Jesus said, "Who touched me?" he knew who had touched him. Even though the disciples said, with so many pressing around you, how do you expect to know? How do you expect to figure out, how would you know who touched you? I mean, a whole bunch of people have been touching you. But Jesus used that as an opportunity to impress upon them, not only did he know who had touched him, but also the reason that they had touched him. And he was also telling the woman, he looked around, he didn't say who was the person, he says who was the woman. So he was looking for the woman because he knew it was the woman that had touched him. He was impressing upon her that this Old Testament superstition about if you just touch the garment of the individual, that's what's going to heal you. That's not factual. That's not that's not the truth. The point is that you had faith in me. You had faith in me, and therefore I healed you based upon your faith in me. Because if you hadn't had faith in me, you wouldn't have touched my garment in the first place. So even though you used the Old Testament superstition, still you knew whose garment to touch. You certainly didn't touch any of the Pharisees that were around you. Okay? So he was really using it in terms of not only impressing upon those who saw what happened, but he also was impressing upon the woman that the power was not within the garment. The power was within him. And it was he who blessed her by healing her. Because Mark's account says immediately he knew when she touched him, and immediately her blood flow dried up. So this was not something that just is going to occur over a period of time. It was immediate. So the power was an instantaneous remedy for the hemorrhaging that she had been suffering from. And he was also saying it in such a way that the woman would know that he did not want her to think that he didn't he didn't want her to think that it was the power was within the garment, but rather he wanted to make sure that she understood that the power was within him. And it was her faith in him that brought about the healing. Okay? Sorry about that. Happens now and then. That's right. That's right. Okay, any questions about that? You know, the other part that's interesting too is that Jesus didn't remember what the woman did afterward. She trembled, she fell down at his feet and started worshiping, right? And then she spilled her guts, so to speak, in terms of what she had been going through. Jesus spared her the indignity because remember, and again, you go back to the old law, look at Leviticus, any person of the Jewish faith who had a blood flow, and specifically women during their menstruation cycle, but any person who had a blood flow going could not benefit from any of the customary, traditional, ritual Jewish religious practices. They were forbidden because they were considered to be unclean, in the same sense that you had an unclean animal. And so her venting, so to speak, I guess, but her confessing what she had been through and how she had gone through it and everything was her way of expressing how not only how physically whole she felt, but it also had the spiritual implication that now she was whole spiritually also. Okay? So a dual implication there, both from the physical and the spiritual. But it's also important that when Jesus makes the statement, go in peace, he's telling her that she can go and have the peace of mind that she has been made whole and that she never have to worry about being unclean again. Okay? And so that's also another very important spiritual implication of the whole thing. Okay? Any other questions or comments about the woman that had the hemorrhage? Okay, now we need to turn to Matthew's account because Matthew is the only one of these three gospels that records these next two incidents of the first one being the healing of the two blind men and the healing of another demoniac. This is not the same demoniac that we had studied about earlier. But in the case of the two blind men, it's really interesting. The first interesting thing is the symbolism on the part of the two blind men is that the two blind men could see Christ as the Messiah, but people who had full sight didn't and wouldn't accept it. So talk about some real heavy, profound symbolism there. The fact that men that are physically blind could still see the spiritual side of it in that Jesus was the Messiah, having come in the person of Jesus the Christ. Okay? And it indicates that the account indicates that the two blind men were following him and specifically appealed to him to help them, not only to help them, but cure them. Okay? And how did they refer to Jesus? As the Son of David. Isn't that an interesting application too? An interesting salutation, so to speak, is that they recognize that Jesus was of the lineage of the King David. And on the spiritual side, okay, not just on the physical side, but on the spiritual side to that. But did Jesus heal them right off the bat simply because they made that appeal to him? What did he say to them? Do you remember? What? Yeah. Do you believe that I can? So, in other words, do you have faith, right? Do you have the belief that I can do it? Okay. So he was testing them to make sure that they understood what was going to make them well. Okay? And that was that they believed that Jesus was able to do it. And since they replied in the manner that they did, they, for lack of any other term, they passed the test, so to speak. Okay? And Jesus healed them. Okay? And how did he show that it was his power by which they were healed? How did he demonstrate that to those around? He touched their eyes. Okay? He touched their eyes. So that the people that were there in their presence would know that it was his touching of the eyes by which he healed their eyes and therefore healed them. So it was his power that made them well. It wasn't just, it wasn't some made up thing like, like the old charlatan faith healers do. They'd have somebody in the professing to not be able to see, but they really could see. Okay, so he made it clear that it was his touching of the eyes that because of their faith they were made well, and it was a demonstration to others around them. And then again, what was his stern warning to them? Don't tell anybody. Okay, again, he's still trying to make sure that he can still move about freely without being, kidnapped, so to speak, by or brought down by the Pharisees and the scribes. And so they also received the same stern warning as others had got. But what did they do with that? Fully complied, right? And they acted human. They acted human, right? They acted human, except that here's the one fallacious part of acting human sometimes is when the Lord tells us not to do something and we do it. Okay? Yeah, we're acting human. Okay? Now, so the two blind men did tell others about it. Okay? There is writings by some religious organizations. One organization which shall remain nameless, but they're the largest Christian religious organization in the world. I'll just leave it at that. Who say that they actually praised the two men for doing that because they spread the word farther and greater as to how wonderful Jesus was. There is a writing by the Reformed Church, let me put it that way, a Reformed Church who says you can't praise someone because they sinned. They were disobedient to the Lord. The Lord told them not to do it, and they did it anyway. So don't praise them for what they did, because he had a reason for them not doing what he asked them not to do. So don't make a hero out of someone who does something that the Lord tells them not to do. And so that particular group, of course, would subscribe to the rule that whatever is written, whatever Jesus said or whatever God says is the rule, and that's what you live by. And whether you like it or not, that's the rule, and that's what you live by. And we know that God in Old Testament scriptures said what? What does he desire more than even the sacrifices, all those sacrifices that he created for people to do? Obedience. Hosea 6:6. The Lord delights in loyalty rather than sacrifices. Or 1 Samuel 15:22. To obey is better than sacrifice, to heed better than the fat of rams. And so it's always been about obedience that God has wanted. And so please don't make this out to be some great deed that they performed by telling others. Jesus would have had other ways of making sure everybody knew about this. I mean, he had 3 gospel writers. Well, Matthew's the only one that did this particular thing, but there were plenty of other things that the gospel accounts did. Even though we know Mark didn't actually write his until 40 years after these incidents happened, nevertheless, Peter was going about and repeating these things over and over and over again. That's how Mark learned a lot of his. Okay, and so if Jesus says to do something, you do it. If Jesus says not to do something, you don't do it. It's just simply because what he wants is obedience. Okay? Yes. Everybody. Well, it would. Many of who saw it were the Pharisees and the scribes anyway. Okay, so he didn't. You know, they're certainly not gonna tell the good parts, right? But yes, it would apply to anybody who is a believer. That if you know if my mother told me not to do something that was generic in terms of my 2 sisters, well, the saying went for them also. Okay, so it's so the fact that he only told these 2 blind men applies equally to them. And then the last one that Matthew recorded was the mute man that was possessed of a demon. Okay, we talked last time. We talked about the demoniac there in the Gadarenes. We spent a lot of detail talking about demons and the evil spirits, etc. The point here is that they brought a mute man who was possessed of a demon. When the demon was cast out, the mute man began to speak. And again, the Pharisees accused him of doing the same thing that they had accused him of earlier. He's doing it by the power of what? Yeah, the prince of demons, the ruler of the demons, Beelzebub. Okay, so Beelzebul actually. So the Pharisees, while they were unwilling to admit, they couldn't deny it because they saw it took place. So they had to turn it around in such a direction that would try to bring him down. But the same thing, Jesus would tell him the same thing again, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. I told you last time. How much sense does it make that if I'm casting out evil spirits by the power of the devil? How much sense would that make? Wouldn't you think that I'd want that the devil would want the evil spirit still left in the person? So it was he probably perhaps at this time was becoming a little bit tired of reciting the same things to people who are unreasonable and illogical. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I don't know that would necessarily. That's necessarily what he didn't want them doing was running out, just like he told Jairus, the people that were in Jairus, don't tell anybody about it. You know?
and yet the person doesn't sit there and say, oh, wait a minute. It wasn't, 20 things that I did. I only did like one thing. So I think Christ doesn't want the attention, and he doesn't want he don't want accolades, because it's God's will that he's doing by these healings. So it's kind of like in this world. There's a lot of people that go out to hospitals, they do good work, and they don't want it to be public. They don't want to be, thrown, all this glory for what a great person they are. They just want to do the good deed. And then Christ is like that, I think, to some extent.
Well, I don't know if it's so much that, because that would be purely human, okay? In Jesus' case, the reason that he didn't is he kept saying, my time has not yet come. And remember that every time somebody said something or told something about the great wonders and signs and miracles that he did, it brought upon him the wrath and the notoriety from the wrong people, his enemies. And so just like this time, as other times, he just simply wanted them not to go out and broadcast it all over the place, because then people would know that he's in the area, so to speak. And he wanted to be able to still move about and be free to move about where he needed to go to perform his works, because it was not yet time for him to finish his work. Okay. Okay. So remember, the biggest, or the key word in all of these that we've studied here Sunday and tonight, the key word is faith or belief. You can say it either way. And that is that it is faith which makes a person whole. It's faith in doing what the Lord wants us to do, and what the Lord commands us to do, and what the Lord expects us to do. And this is not working our way, the spiritual implication here is not working our way to wherever we need to be because of faith only, but it's about the faith that puts us into the action which will bring about that wholesomeness. These people did not just simply carry around a faith that lay dormant. These people actually put their faith into action. And that's what brought about their being able to be healed from whatever infirmity that they had. Okay. So Sunday, Jason's going to cover the class for a couple of months, and it'll be Jesus rejected at Nazareth, lesson 43 next week. I'll do the same thing with these questions that I did. I know you just got the answers today from last week, because I got them to Jennifer late. It's not Jennifer's fault. It never is Jennifer's fault, believe me. Okay? So I'll do the same thing with these. And the reason I didn't want it sent out last weekend was because I didn't want Jennifer to have to work over the weekend. So, but I will get these to her, and she can send them out to you. If you have any questions about my answers or whatever, you can let me know on Sunday. Okay? Thank you very much.